Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today, we're going to move our story of European encroachment around the world to Africa and look at the various ways in which Europeans encroached on African territory and how various African peoples responded to this encroachment. As a quick warning, Africa is a massive, diverse continent, so we're going to have to skip around a little bit and we're going to oversimplify some of these things because, again, we don't have the time, unfortunately, to go into each of these African societies. But keep in mind, we'll come back and learn more about these various African peoples and African leaders when we start talking about the resistance to European imperialism and eventually the decolonization movement. So here's our objectives for today. Let's dive in and tell our story. Africa, as we've talked about before, is an incredibly diverse, very, very large continent with tons of different tropical zones. It's very difficult to navigate because of geographic barriers like the Sahara Desert and the sort of Congo basin. These areas prevent easy migration around Africa. And so we see these large isolated kingdoms grow up in Africa in these specific regions, but we don't see as much interchange between these areas as we would between the Eurasian societies that were connected together along things like the Silk Road. And so this leads to African societies developing somewhat in isolation of each other. And so that's going to affect the development of Africa. We should also know that Africa is a continent of spectacularly rich resources of gold and coal and oil and rubber and all of these other sort of resources. And so Africa has spectacular natural wealth. The problem, again, is going to be developing that wealth and then trading it to other people in order to help develop a long-term sort of stable economy. Europeans have been encroaching on Africa ever since the age of exploration. We talked about this before. We'd seen British, French, Portuguese, Ottoman groups taking over parts along the coast of Africa. But Europeans had really struggled to get into the interior of Africa for a whole host of different reasons. Part of this is because of African diseases, especially diseases that killed horses, which prevented Europeans from encroaching in Africa. Some of this is also diseases like malaria and yellow fever, tropical diseases that Europeans were not particularly well adapted to. Part of this is African rivers, which in general are very difficult to navigate. And part of it is African people who did not like European encroachment. And if the Europeans weren't providing them with useful resources, were perfectly capable and able to defend their territory from hostile European groups. South Africa was one of the first areas to be settled in large numbers by Europeans because it is on the southern tip of Africa and it is much more temperate. You don't have to deal with some of the same tropical diseases. And so we first got Dutch colonies settling in and coming into contact with the local Bantu peoples. And then the British began to settle South Africa as it was an important stop off in their path to try to get to East India, to the Southeast Asia, and to China. So first Dutch traders and then settlers, and then British traders and settlers began to settle in South Africa. They fought with the local Zulu peoples in the local Bantu-speaking peoples in what are known as the Zulu Wars. These wars originally went relatively poorly for the Europeans because the Zulus were a pretty sophisticated people with advanced military tactics involving using specific rhythms to coordinate movements over a long period of time, over large distances. And so the Zulus were able to outmaneuver and defeat several British forces before eventually being defeated by superior numbers and new technologies. Specifically, the Maxim machine gun and steam-powered riverboats, combined with the discovery of quinine, which helped to treat malaria, allowed Europeans to overcome the various barriers that we talked about previously and begin to encroach more deeply into the African continent. This process happened very slowly over a period of time, first opening up trading posts, then sending in missionaries, and then eventually more soldiers and more Europeans. At the Berlin Conference, we began to see Africa carved up by various European powers. There was a concern by European powers that competition over the conquest of Africa would lead to war between European countries. This is in the run-up to World War I, where we're seeing the rise of nationalism and the naval arms race starting to create lots of conflict. And so at this conference, Cecil Rhodes helped to broker this deal in which most African countries were divided up amongst European powers, and then the European powers would move in and encroach and take direct control over these colonies. The one exception to this is Ethiopia, which modernized and pushed back strongly against Europeans. King Menelik II here pushed back against the Italian forces attacking him, having modernized and brought in modern military equipment that he had gotten from the Ottoman Empire and other advanced countries. At the Battle of Adwa, take a moment, read and respond to this. And therefore the Ethiopians remained independent, as did the colony of Liberia, which had been established by the American Colonization Society as a place to drop off freed slaves in the 1820s. So Liberia and Ethiopia remain independent, but the rest of Africa gets conquered, and generally it goes pretty poorly. The Congo Free State was a Belgian territory controlled directly by Leopold II and was responsible for some of the worst atrocities towards native African peoples. The Congo Free State was important for the production of rubber and also for mining. And so the Congolese people were treated spectacularly poorly. And this is sort of the example of the most dehumanizing, horrible treatment of African peoples by European monarchs. The Ashanti Empire fought back against the British. The Ashanti Empire is sort of in modern day Ghana, sort of very close to what's called the Gold Coast of Africa here. The Ashanti Empire was led by a warrior queen named Ya Asintawa, and apologies for my mispronunciation of that. She encouraged her people to mobilize and fight back against the British. But the end result of this, much like the end result of most of these resistance movements, was that the British were able to incorporate in her territory into this larger colony called Nigeria. And we ended up seeing, and Nigeria represents one of the problems with European conquest in Africa, because the colony of Nigeria contains a whole bunch of different linguistic groups. It contains a bunch of different ethnic groups. It contains different religious groups. For example, you've got the Igbo people who had incorporated or mostly been converted to Christianity. You have your Yoruba peoples over here that predominantly followed traditional African religions. And then the Hausa and Fulani peoples in the north mostly were Muslims because of the influence of the Malian and Songhai empires. And so by incorporating all these groups together into one political entity, you basically force a bunch of different African peoples who don't really have that much in common with each other into one country, and then more or less ignore their religious and cultural differences. And so a lot of the problems in modern Nigeria stem from conflict between these different ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. And it's one of the ways in which Europeans drawing lines on a map lead to potential problems for African peoples. Most of the time, the Europeans did not care about this and justified their expansion in that it was good for the various African peoples because it would quote unquote civilize them. So pause and read French colonial expansion here. And in general, this is the story of European conquest of Africa. Apologies that it was far too brief. Again, we'll come back and talk about a lot of these peoples again when we start looking at resistance movements, the growth of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism as we move into the 1900s. So for now, most of Africa is ostensibly controlled by European countries, and a lot of the resources are being extracted and used for the benefit of Europeans. Thank you for listening.